Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Alec Baldo, and in today's presentation, we will be looking at three iconic artists and their artwork from the cities of Buenos Aires, Havana, and Mexico City. As we dive into discussing their most famous artworks, we will be considering the inspiration behind these pieces and comparing each Latin city, its culture, and its influence on art with each other. Now, today we are going to be starting with Mexico City. We will then move on to Havana, and lastly, we will consider Buenos Aires. At the end of this, there will be a summary to tie all these together, and I hope you enjoy. Now, it would be difficult to explore the wonders of Mexican art without, of course, talking about the importance of muralism. Now, muralism came in the 1920s during a time in Mexico where there was a national identity crisis emerging. Now, this crisis centered around this concept commonly referred to as the Indian problem. Now, as Don Ades says, this Indian problem, as they call it, rumbled the great issue of whether Mexico was one nation or two. And this also created a lot of weight on the role of art during this time. Now, the Mexican government was able to recognize this lack of unity between the indigenous peoples and the new settlers from Europe, and this funded the Mexican mural movement in the 1920s. Now, part of the reason that muralism in Mexico during this time was so effective was because a large portion of Mexico City was actually illiterate. So these murals, these pieces of great art, were able to speak to everybody, and they could be understood everywhere. Now, it should be clear that in Mexican art, one of the most important aspects is the consideration of history. With that being said, what better to encapsulate the history of Mexico than Diego Rivera's mural that's actually called The History of Mexico. Currently, it is located in the National Palace, and it is often referred to as the most influential and significant mural in all of Mexico City. Now, when considering the most famous pieces of art from Havana, you cannot leave Wilfredo Lam from the conversation, as he has 5 of the top 10 most famous pieces of art from Havana. However, despite his success, his art is a rather controversial topic. Now, his primitive style is often offensive to some demographics. Moreover, his art isn't even confined to Cuban origin. In fact, he brings over African culture in his work, and he implements it by using surrealism, which is extremely common in Europe. Some may also criticize him for studying abroad in Spain for some years. Contrast, Cuban professor Gerardo Mosquera believes that Wilfredo was instrumental in bringing African culture into Cuban art. Moreover, he also believes that Wilfredo was a very important figure in surrealism, which is actually one of the top 3 most important styles of art in Cuba. Now, it's really quite interesting to consider how a nation's most prolific artist can be so famous for incorporating art from other cultures. But when you think about it, that really just speaks volume on Havana's cultural diversity. Now, let's consider one of Wilfredo Lam's most famous pieces. This is called The Jungle, and this piece demonstrates his primitive style of surrealism, and this is famous across the entire world. Now, as we consider the meaning behind the art in Havana, and we compare it to the meaning behind the art in Mexico City, we understand that there is, of course, differences, but there are similarities too. And these similarities are based on the principle of realism and understanding and representing colonial history. Buenos Aires is very fortunate to have the world-renowned artists that it does. However, it is not financial value that should rank these paintings, but rather their influence on Argentinian culture. Now, with that being said, Antonio Bruni stands apart from the rest, as his artwork in Argentina, and specifically Buenos Aires, is most influential and very important in Argentinian culture. 60. Now, all of Antonio's works are incredibly important, but one piece that stands out is called Juanito Langura Aprende a Leer, or Juanito Langura Learns to Read. Now, part of the reason that this is so important is because it really speaks on and represents the effects of illiteracy in the streets of Buenos Aires. Now, he also focused on creating politically and socially conscious art depicting the state of people in the country. And he was able to do this by using a term referred to as Nuevo Realismo, or New Reality. Now, according to Guadalupe Girardi, the author of Monsters of Inequality and Waste, he states that Nuevo Realismo emerges in the context of diffusion of the social and socialist realism that arose in the interwar period of 1918 to 1939. Girardi also shares his opinion that Bernese artist's proposal, characterized by its contentious relationship with realist aesthetics, is one of the most central and original aspects of Bernese art. Now, Bernese work was captivating for more reasons than just his realistic and socio-political approach. In fact, his art really displayed his expertise in the collage technique, where he would combine materials such as fabrics, metals, and paper to really create and illustrate his artwork that was ever so stunning and iconic. Now, although Bernese work can represent many things, such as social dilemmas, political matters, and even poverty, all of his work shares a common theme, which is being in response to very powerful issues in Buenos Aires. Although these cities have different cultures surrounding their artwork, they do still share a lot of common ground. Now, in the world of art, it's not uncommon practice for the artworks to be created about issues. However, all three of these cities and all of the artworks that I've considered all seem to share the same issue, which is socio-political. Now, these socio-political issues include the Indian problem in Mexico during the 1920s, as well as the lack of Afro-Cuban representation in Havana. And lastly, not to forget the poverty in youth in Buenos Aires. So we've considered the different socio-political problems, but let's consider how each artist responded to them. So first we have the so-called Indian problem, and Diego Rivera responded to this by working together with the Mexican government in the 1920s, creating a most notable piece of art in Mexico called The History of Mexico. Now, in response to the lack of Afro-Cuban representation, Wilfredo Lamb implemented more primitive African styles of art into his works. Lastly, Antonio Bernini created his artwork about a boy named Juanito Langura, which aimed to bring attention to the poverty in youth in Buenos Aires. In summary, these artists and their most famous artworks have been massive influences within the culture of their own cities. Their importance is immeasurable, and learning about these artists and their artwork has been an absolute privilege. Thank you so much for watching. I forgot what I was talking about. Okay, let's just film a couple. It won't get a first take, but... As Dom Alice says,